Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you're joining us from around the world to this latest installment of the Wits Journalism Midweek Webinar Series. I'm Eric Olander, Managing Editor of the China Africa Project and co-host of the China in Africa podcast. Before we get started with today's discussion, I want to extend a very big thank you to Barry Van Wyck and the team at the Africa China Reporting Project, as well as Anton Harbour and the folks at the Wits Journalism School for pulling together this seminar and the great team that they've kind of brought together for our panelists on very short notice. So just a big kudos to you guys for doing this. Today, we're going to be looking and focusing on whether the COVID-19 outbreak and whether it's creating a media divide and how we as consumers and you as consumers can best navigate all the toxic mix and good quality information and the fake news and all of that mixed together at such an important time that we're all kind of enduring around the world as we deal with this pandemic. So before we get started, let me just kind of put a few dots on the chart, as I like to say, just to set up our discussion. The outbreak by itself is a huge, complicated story if there was nothing else going on. And even if that was just our story, the way that it would be covered in China, in Africa, in the West, in the US, and Europe would be totally different and distinct, even under the best of circumstances. Then, throw in on top of that a lot of racially charged content on social media coming out of Guangzhou, now coming out of the United States, different issues in Africa as well. And that kind of brings up all these topics like discrimination and racism and things like that, all kind of thrown into the mix. On top of that, there's now this increasingly toxic narrative and this narrative duel that we're seeing between the United States and China that Africans are desperately trying to stay out of, but at the end of the day, it is a new front in this emerging Cold War that's happening between the United States and China. And just on top of all of that, we'll sprinkle on a bunch of rumors, fake news, propaganda, misleading information. Just today alone, in fact, on my Twitter feed, I debunked 3 of fake news that kind of came out. So it's coming out fast and furious, and we're really excited that we have someone who does that for a living here today. So all of that together creates a very, very difficult situation for news consumers to figure out what's what at this time when we all need really good information. And we're going to also talk about the practice of journalism, of making this content, and then also for consumers and trying to understand the different points of view. And that's going to be the focus of our discussion today. And to help us do that, we've got an amazing group of panelists. And this is really something very special because this group coming together, again, on short notice, is just very unique. And so it's really great. Let's first start, and we'll go to Beijing, where we want to say hello to Professor Zhang Yanqiu, who's the Deputy Dean of the Institute of Community with Shared Future and Director of the Africa Communication Research Center at the Communication University of China in Beijing. A very good evening to you, Professor Zhang.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's nice to meet you here.
It's wonderful to see you again. And then we're going to head now all the way over to Tennessee in the United States, where it's a very, very early start for Jeremy Goldkorn, who's the editor-in-chief of SupChina and host of the Sinica podcast. Listen, if you're not familiar with who Jeremy is, then you're really not paying attention to what's going on in the China space. Jeremy's been kind of following China, consumed by China, we like to say, involved in Chinese affairs, startups and all that, dating back to the mid-90s. He's today editor of SupChina, which is an indispensable news resource focused on all aspects of what's going on in China. And of course, with Kaiser Kuo, he's the co-host of the Sinica podcast. A very good early morning to you, Jeremy.
Good morning, Eric, and hello, everyone. Thank you for having me.
And then we're thrilled to be able to have from Nigeria, Mayowa Tijani. Mayowa is a longtime business journalist. He was at the Cable, and now he's leading the AFP Facebook fact-checking drive in Nigeria, where he's busy, of course, debunking a lot of the rumors and fake news. I've used a lot of his work, what I do in the coverage at the China Africa Project, so I am honored and humbled to have you here today. Good afternoon, Mayowa. It's really nice to see you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. I look forward to this discussion.
I just want to start with a general question from each of you, just to kind of, let's get the lay of the land before we dive into the specifics. And Professor Zhang, I'm going to talk with you to give us your assessment of how you evaluate the media coverage, particularly looking at from the Chinese side, but also sitting in Beijing, looking out at the rest of the world, and you follow what's happening in Africa. And just to give us a kind of an introduction to what your perspective is on the coverage, the quality of the coverage, and what's coming through and where we are today in this story.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric. And it sounds a very big question at the beginning. And actually, our research team has been monitoring the media, both the African media and also Western media on this COVID-19 issues. And we did a special report on the Guangzhou incident. So we find that both the African media and also the Western media, they tend to follow the traditional way to do the reports on China, Africa, which means when they report China, it's quite negative as it has been. And the African media, the same, especially on the Guangzhou issue. We find there's some, the issue is not that simple, it's a complicated issue. But, as to this meeting is called, it's COVID-19 creating a media divide. I think I would like to give an answer and for this and to answer your question. But actually, I don't think the COVID-19 create a media divide, but it shows us the differences and similarities of the media between China, Africa, and even the West. So, but we have some challenges as well, which means not only the African media, but also Chinese media should reflect on what we should do. What is our responsibility? What is our priority in reporting such, a crisis? So I think all the media, the government are challenged by the social media. We know the social media, there are so many fake news and post-truths, in fact, and they are, they're too emotional, footages. So it's quite challenging, which means I think, I don't think they are much divided, but I would like to see we're facing a lot of challenges.
Okay. Jeremy, let's get your take. You're somebody who sits and looks at Chinese news coverage all day, as what you do at SupChina. What do you think of what Professor Zhang was saying, and what's your outlook on the divide or the coverage and how it's perceived in the different parts of the world?
I agree with Professor Zhang that COVID-19 didn't create the divide, but it has exacerbated it. And it has exacerbated and accelerated a lot of other trends, geopolitical trends, that we now see reflected in the media. And of course, one of the biggest ones of those is the deteriorating relationship between the United States and China. So I don't think that we can blame COVID-19 for the fact that we have different media narratives, but it has made it very obvious how extreme the differences are between ways of approaching reporting on reality are. And this is not to insinuate that the Chinese press is all propaganda and the American press is all free. I think it has also shown up inadequacies in the Western press. And what I'm speaking of is the coverage of COVID-19, which started in January. I mean, I know I first wrote about it on January 4, and that was about the time when it first began being reported in English. And the Western press tended to treat the disease as a Chinese problem. And a lot of the coverage was focused on the political aspect of the disease, not the healthcare, not the scientific aspect of the disease. And I think one result of that was that much of the West was left unprepared for the fact that COVID-19 would come and find people out in Italy and in New York. So I think that's one other aspect to bear in mind, that COVID-19, it sort of exposed some of the weaknesses in the press too. And I think certainly in the Western press, it exposed a certain attitude to reporting on disasters in China and other countries, non-Western countries, I'll say, rather than developing countries, where we look at those problems and think that they are isolated problems and that they're not problems that are going to become global.
Right. Mayowa, you're sitting in a very interesting vantage point. One, you're in Nigeria, which is interesting, and we'll get to that. But two, you're following what's going on social media. And let's remind everybody that Africa is a continent where the median age is 19.7 years old, a young continent. This is a continent where news consumption has changed radically over the years. And a lot of people, if not a majority, are getting their news from social media. So much in the China-Africa coverage now is playing out on Facebook, on WhatsApp groups, on Twitter, and other places. Talk to us a little bit about how you see the coverage, both the fake news, but also the non-fake news that's come out in the past 2 months related to COVID-19, to what happened in Guangzhou, and to the current China-Africa discussion.
Thank you very much. For Nigeria, the reporting on COVID-19 started a little bit later than the rest of the world. We started reporting it late January, early February. And the way it has played out in the country has been, of course, the first thing we saw was a surge in the amount of fake news that we get as related to health issues, health challenges. So people started sharing what they considered as cure to the disease. And of course, they started sharing information from WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, a lot of misinformation here and there. But what has been a little more interesting with how it has been covered here in Nigeria is the fact that for Nigeria, the disease is not just a pandemic that is health related. For a country that is heavily dependent on oil, it is also an economic problem. And this is also affecting the media in many ways more than just reporting it. So the existing mistrust between the political class and then the people, and then of course, with the advent of fake news, there's also been some portion of that distrust cast on the media. So when the media is reporting a certain number of cases or something about coronavirus here and there, there's this, is like we're challenging what is on there on social media, which may or may not be proven. So at this point in time, the search for credible information is challenged by this particular outbreak.
Okay, Professor Zhang, Mayowa brought up the issue of trust and distrust, and I think we should just get right into it. Our time is limited today, so we're not going to kind of waste time here. So one of the things that I've noticed in the coverage is it feels like Chinese and Africans are having two separate discussions, in part because in China, people can't see Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, all of the social media sites. And for example, all of the videos that came out of Guangzhou that riled up and continue to rile up people into anger and frustrate people, people in China don't see. And so there's this disconnect that's going on in the discourse between what Chinese people who are seeing Weibo, Weixin, WeChat, and Chinese official media and that narrative, and then the narrative that we're seeing in Africa, which is something driven by social media, which people they're talking past each other in many ways. Professor Zhang, I'd like to kind of hear your thoughts on this idea of people talking past one another.
Okay, I think partly you are right. In China, we don't use those so-called international social media, but Chinese domestic social media are not consumed by the Africans. But that does not mean there is no bridge between China and Africa. Actually, both the Western media, Chinese international media, and African media, and most of the media online could consumed by both sides. But the problem, I think, is how much we can trust the social media. Because the social media, some of the media, like the Guangzhou, about the Guangzhou incident, and it's quite emotional and without any sources. You cannot check where the sources, where is it from, and Even there's some fake news on the social media. So you cannot think social media is that reliable. But at the same time, I think both, Chinese government and African government are facing the challenges, how to regulate the media and how to make a better use of social media. So I don't think we are in the two different worlds, but, Guangzhou issue was also highly discussed in China. So it's not something secret the government tried to hide, but I think it's also a good opportunity for Chinese, the people and also government to rethink about those issues related to African history and the discrimination issues. Yes.
Yeah, Jeremy, let me get your take on this. As you looked at these issues. So Professor Zhang says the gap isn't as wide as it's made out to seem. You look at this from the point of view in the United States, and I would say we have a similar issue in the United States where Chinese media and American media are often talking past each other, and Americans and Chinese don't always connect and understand one another. And I think the same, I mean, you're South African, you follow this very closely. What's your take in terms of how journalists and the news media and social media have covered the issue in such a way in that people actually are using a common language or not?
Yeah, it's difficult to see people using a common language now. I'm not sure if we're still talking about COVID-19 or to the harassment of Africans in Guangzhou. But in both cases, yeah, we're not talking a common language. I mean, China, of course, the big problem is that the government blocks most international media and all international social media, thus denying all but a small number of people the opportunity to even interact with their global peers. In the United States, the problem is completely different. It's that most people are consuming entertainment, and that the news has devolved into a kind of degraded infotainment, essentially. And Fox News is notoriously the worst, and obviously, Trump supporting right wing and full of racism. But looking at CNN, it's you don't get a very accurate picture of the whole world from watching mainstream American media. You have to do the work of reading, and most people aren't willing to do that. So, I mean, I think I disagree with Professor Zhang that the gap isn't as wide as we think it might be. I sometimes think it might be even wider than we think it might be. And it's not just America, China. I mean, I think you're seeing the events in Guangzhou have revealed a similar issue in Africa, in the sense that, for most young Africans, reading about China for the first time, if they were in the last 6 months, what they would have seen is video clips of Africans being harassed, evicted, turned out onto the streets in Guangzhou, and that will be their impression. And although it was widely talked about in China, it wasn't as widely talked about as it was on African social media.
That's right, that's right. Let's go to a question. And Mayowa, I'm going to bring the question to you. Herman Wasserman, who is a well-known media scholar in South Africa, we're going to pick up on what Jeremy was talking about, and also what Professor Zhang, in terms of these stereotypes and the misperceptions that come out. And Herman says, given the existing, often contested relationship between Africa and China, do we see the COVID-19 crisis exacerbating stereotypes, biases about China in African media? And are there examples of misinformation, which is what you look for, that draw on these different stereotypes? So talk to us a little bit about misinformation and the stereotypes and how they're exacerbated or not in African social media.
Yes, since the outbreak, we've seen an increase of, you see just any random video of, okay, let me give an example. There was a fire outbreak here in somewhere in southwest Nigeria, one of the popular markets. And the next day on social media, there were already videos that some people were burning Chinese shops in that particular market. Now, we also saw like some old videos from China where some, of course, Africans were being maltreated. And then it was trending on social media for like a week. And then there was another one of the Nigerian ambassador to China confronting some Chinese people on the role how they were treating some particular citizens of Nigeria in China. So basically, all of this has heightened has kind of affected the relationship basically between how we see the Chinese and maybe otherwise. So the case, of course, is getting worse as a result of this particular pandemic, and of course, the fake news that is coming into the picture here and there. And to make matters worse, so the particular example I gave about the markets that were set on fire, when we were trying to get the information to say Chinese shops were burnt or not, we contacted the police to get more information, and they were like, they cannot release any information on that. The investigations were still ongoing. So while investigations are still ongoing, people have taken that space, that vacuum, to say that this is what is happening, this is what we feel about the Chinese, and this is how we are going to deal with it. So I think that it's absolutely correct to say at this point that with the intervention of misinformation, and of course with the videos that we've seen, even if they were from the past, on social media about how some Africans were treated in China, it creates a certain kind of stereotype which would be very difficult to undo in the near future.
So, Professor Zhang, let's kind of pick up on that, because it really comes to this question of authenticity. And, Mike, who is a South Sudanese journalist, he has a question about, he says, how do we ensure that fake news is real news? Now, the problem is with real news, it becomes very murky as to, well, whose definition of real news? So it goes back to, and I don't want to only spend time on the Guangzhou incident, because the COVID-19 is much bigger than that. But whether we talk about the COVID-19 origin, that's a dispute, and that's covered differently in different parts of the world, or we talk about what happened in Guangzhou. In Guangzhou, the Chinese media and the Chinese government was saying there's no racism and there's no discrimination in China. And that is the official policy. Zhao Lijian, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, repeated it. Ambassadors across the continent said, we want to assure you there's no racism and there's no discrimination against Africans or anybody in China. The problem is that people like Mayowa and others were looking at their social media feeds and seeing not fake videos, but legitimate videos, as Jeremy pointed out, of Africans being maltreated. It was not fake, it was there. And so we have this disconnect. Then all of a sudden we get into this question of real news. And so how do we sort out, as news consumers, the Chinese position that says there's no discrimination versus the videos that people see with their own eyes that show that things were happening? What's a consumer to do, in your view?
I think that's a very good question. You know, I do media literacy studies. I think for my suggestions for the media users, especially the internet users, they should, they should understand the most fundamental thing is media. If it is a single source, it's easy to be biased. I watched a video from the SADC, and it's only interviewed one African student from Guangzhou on this issue, but I would say it's a single. It didn't interview any Chinese student. It didn't interview any African student in China. Any other Chinese student in China, for example, student in my university, African student, they do enjoy their life during the COVID-19, and the university, I'm sure most of the Chinese university treat them very well, like princess and prince. So there are a lot of stories like that, but unfortunately, those media didn't give even 1 second to those pictures. So which means you cannot just blame the media users to be media literate or to be information literate. At the same time, I think the media should also take the responsibility. They didn't provide the whole picture. I mean, the report is not very well balanced. Think about, not only African people was sort of mistreated in China, and also in the United States. You think about Chinese people also mistreated in other countries, in the US, in some European countries, in Africa as well. You think about people died in Zambia, and the factories were burned in Nigeria. So that's that's the common problem faced by us. So part of that is, I think the media should take this part of the responsibility, how to cover, how to provide more balanced report instead of just pay attention to a single fact.
I will tell you, as somebody who reports on China Africa every day and does a podcast twice a week, I cannot get Chinese guests to appear on the show. It's pure and simple. It used to be easier 6 months ago. Before 6 months ago, I could call up Chinese professors, scholars, analysts, and they would say, sure, I'll come on and you can go through our archives and you can see it. In the past 3 to 4 months now, everybody says no. And African journalists complain about the same thing.
You didn't send an invitation to me.
Oh, well, you're booked for next week, by the way. But it is and I get comments from a lot of African journalists who say, Eric, can you help me introduce me to a Chinese source, either at the embassy, either at a think tank, either someone else like that? And they universally say no. So what should an African journalist do if they want to interview a Chinese official?
I should tell you a different story. I help our African journalists, both from Nigeria and also Senegal, to reach our embassy and to interview our webinar on China-Africa relations. And I think it depends who you reached and how can you reach those people. I know that my former students and journalists, I know I help them to try to reach, Chinese sources. Yeah, it really depends. You cannot draw that conclusion completely.
But do you have any suggestions for African journalists? Because we have a lot of journalists in our audience today. And what tips and recommendations would you have if they want to interview? As you said, we want to have more balance in the coverage. How would someone like Mayowa at AFP or Jeremy at SupChina or somebody at SABC, what tips and practical, if they want to interview Chinese sources, what would you recommend they do?
One is if they like to have, for example, those from TV, I think if we reach Chinese media, like CGTN, like Xinhua, like, I think they are quite open to share their, sources. And I know that CGTN, they have a CCTV Plus, and they share all the free footage worldwide. It's a free to use all the footage, and they can reach the embassy. They can reach the Chinese. It's interesting. Even when those issues occurred, I think Chinese part also like to reach the African local media. I also suggest my government to try to, speak on the local media and try to let the African local journalists to report on this. I even submit a proposal to invite to the government to invite African journalists back to to do the interview after the COVID-19 to Guangzhou, to Wuhan, to report on this, to do the field investigation. So I think we should set up sort of framework to link the Chinese side and also African side. This is some work we should do, but I don't think there's no way for that. There's a lot of possible channels.
Yeah. Franz Kruger, he asks a question saying, why do I think that there's hesitance on the Chinese side? I'll say that I think people are more concerned about saying something that will get them in trouble. I think that conditions now are very sensitive, particularly on issues related to US, China, geopolitics, economics. And I think, a mid-level analyst or scholar, not a big official like an ambassador, those guys, and they know what they'll be fine. But we're talking about a professor at Beijing University or an analyst at the Shanghai Institute of International Studies, those normal run-of-the-mill scholars who we interview every day in Washington or London or Johannesburg, I think that there's concern that they will say something that will get them in trouble, and I think they're more hesitant. That's the only thing I can think of.
No, that's not the truth. I think even during the Guangzhou incident, and we were encouraged by our university, by our colleagues to speak up, to find more chances to speak up and to explain the issue to the African media.
Okay, Jeremy, let's get you to weigh in on this. You've been covering Chinese media for 30, I won't say it. I don't want to date you on that one, but you've been covering Chinese media for a long time. Tone, a shift or anything, or or do you see what Professor Zhang is saying, that they're trying to open up and be more expressive?
I have to disagree with Professor Zhang that, I mean, if the idea that things are as open as they ever were, I think there's no question that in China, since Xi Jinping became top leader, the environment for people speaking their mind has deteriorated pretty significantly. So, I mean, I see the question you're asking, the challenge of trying to get Chinese voices to go on the record or even off the record for journalists is really, really difficult. And, you know, I think that is one of the big problems China has in trying to tell its story to Africa and to other countries in a different way from the Western media, or in a contrast from, for example, a lot of the stuff that's going on African social media, is because the voices that come through strongest, I mean, the media presence in Africa, CGTN, the state TV, is a very powerful Chinese media presence in Africa. And there are some private players involved in television, but certainly in terms of news, I think CGTN is probably the most powerful. And this presents the Chinese state view of matters. And while that might be a view and it might sometimes be correct, there's a reason why CGTN fails globally to attract a significant audience, is because the Chinese official point of view is extremely wooden and extremely unappealing, generally speaking, and doesn't generally speak to the concerns of local people. And without allowing the noise of Chinese civil society to speak up for itself, I fear that in Africa and elsewhere, the voices we'll hear coming from China will primarily be the voice of the state. And as long as that continues, it will be difficult for people in Africa and elsewhere to see that China is perhaps a more complex country than the stereotype would indicate.
Okay, sorry, my video froze there for a second. Mayowa, you've been listening to the discussion. You have heard two very different points of view on the China-Africa relationship. I'd like you to weigh in on where do you kind of fall down on the spectrum between Professor Zhang on one side, who says that China is trying to reach out and to do more to engage African media. You were at the cable for a long time. Now you're doing fact checking. And then Jeremy, who says that in recent years, it's become more closed, more state-driven. CGTN messaging reflects the issues of the state, but not necessarily those of African civil society. Give us your take on where on this discussion between those two pillars.
I think I'm closer to Jeremy than the professor. In my experience, of course, I've had times where we've needed to get some information out of China, and sometimes it's extremely difficult. I studied with some friends who came to study media practice in the UK from China. And so getting in touch with them to say, okay, I'd like you to speak about this. I'd like you to give me more information on this or that. More often than not, they cannot. In fact, for some of them, they prefer to move out to, say, Vietnam or come down to Africa to actually practice journalism. So I think that the Chinese media, of course, has like a so like a particular way they want you to see China, and anything outside that, you probably would hear it elsewhere away from China. So, okay, so let me give an example. When there was a time earlier this year where China, based on this particular study, was reported by one of the state media outlets that the chloroquine had shown some promise for treating COVID-19. Now, when we found that, we needed a little more information about the whole process, the study and all that. And it was extremely difficult to get someone to speak publicly about all of that. So, and you know, in this particular situation where it has to do with health care, and of course in a country like Nigeria that chloroquine happens to be quite popular, there was a lot of conversation around that, but it was majorly African because we couldn't get enough voices to come in from the other side. So I feel like the way the relationship is if we are speaking about China in Africa, we do not get enough Chinese voices. And if we are speaking about Africa in China, we also do not get enough African voices. So the link is still not good enough.
Yeah. What do you think, Mayowa, can be done? Let's get to some practical solutions. We've identified the problem, but I'd like to see if we can get to some practical, productive solutions.
I think that a lot of what can be done has to start, a portion of it has to start with China. And of course, if we are being truthful with ourselves, we would probably say that would not happen anytime soon. On the African side, what we can do and what we've been doing is trying as much as possible to put out as much facts as we have available to us. So if you say that this is happening in China, personally, we might not be able to get a voice from China to speak about a certain video or a certain incident. But using our own technical tools at AFP, we are able to say, oh, this particular video was shot in 2016 and not 2020. So it has nothing to do with COVID-19 or this. So on our own side, we are just employing digital tools to be able to say, we know that you have your opinions about China, but this is what we know the facts are. So if we can do that a lot more on the African side, I think that we can pass more, we can make people make informed choices, not just stereotypical opinion about China. So for the Chinese media, it's going to take a lot more than using digital tools and all that. So it's going to be some easing, opening up, diplomatic decisions and all that, which of course is beyond us at this side of the continent.
Professor Zhang, one of the biggest challenges in the China-Africa media relationship is that too few African journalists have a very solid understanding of China, its politics, its history, its economics, all of that. And the same is true in reverse. I was speaking with some journalists at a Shanghai publication, and the editors, not the journalists, it's the editors who control what goes on to the homepage, where the journalists do things. Their idea, they're very click-driven in many of the bigger news sites. They want stories that are sensational. They want stories that are exciting. And if you're talking about the run-of-the-mill, everyday African story, for a normal Chinese news consumer, like a normal US or even to some extent European news consumer, Africa is very far away. And at the end of the day, when we're talking about issues like COVID-19, the knowledge is quite low. What do you think can be done in China to help improve the overall knowledge, especially for editors, to get them to better understand some of the issues going on in Africa today?
I think that's a very important question. It's a very essential for both sides to understand each other. You know, let me give you one example. Every year we have a couple of African journalists visiting us, and once I ask them, "Do you know FOCAC?" And they don't know. They never heard of that. So that really surprised me. And African journalists, they are already in China, but they never heard of FOCAC. So, which means they really lack of knowledge about China-Africa cooperation. And it's the same. And I think Chinese media, we still like, we like to, encourage more journalists and to be expert on China-Africa relation. So that's why in recent years, and like Tsinghua University, we did a training every year to train our young and potential journalists to report on China, Africa, and by with a new approach, which means more constructively and let them to focus on China, Africa. So I think it's a challenging for both sides.
Jeremy, as an African who's lived in China, now in the US, you've kind of seen it from a lot of different perspectives. Most people in the US still see Africa as a place of war, famine, AIDS, child soldiers. Let's go through the list of stereotypes. Safaris, all of that. And there's been efforts to try and change that perception. China, in many ways now, following Wolf Warrior 2, and we're starting to see the iconography and the relationship align itself in much the same way that it has in the US and Europe for decades. What do you think, as someone who's kind of, as an African living abroad in China and in the West, what can be done to help improve the quality of understanding on the part of Chinese journalists about Africa, in your opinion? Or Africans about China in reverse?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question. What's a good question? I mean, if I had a magic wand, I think I would just move large groups of young people who are interested in journalism around the world, 1,000 from China to various parts of Africa and vice versa. I think some of the most powerful ways that people in China have become informed about Africa have been, for example, a few years ago, there was a young Chinese guy compiling a Swahili Chinese dictionary and blogging about it on Chinese social media websites, and gathering quite a following. And he was writing about East Africa, mostly Kenya, as he saw it, not this Wolf Warrior movie stereotype or the American media stereotype. And that seems to me the most powerful thing, is to have ordinary, I think the big problem with us, particularly in the United States, but everywhere around the world, understanding other countries, is that the only thing that we really think of as news is bad news. So although, if you're in America, you are exposed to good news and bad news all the time, the news that comes out of Africa is typically bad news. And the news that comes out of China too is typically, it's either China's bad, or China's big, or China's weird. I mean, those are the three stories you get about China in the American press, typically. It's scary, it's very, very big, or it's doing something weird. Africa, you tend to get something scary and horrible is going on. And it's very difficult to break through the noise of the news with something that isn't just bad news. So, I think if there's anything that governments or people can do is to encourage more citizen exchange and more, I hate to say it, but more social media, more citizen journalism. I see.
No, don't hate to say that. We like social media. To that point, I've just put in the chat for everybody a vlogger from South Africa, Fejo Moli. And this, I think, is, and I've featured more and more of these young Chinese who are posting on YouTube, Instagram for an international audience. And Moli is a really interesting example of what Jeremy's talking about. Number one, she talks about positive engagement. She talks about it. She is distinctly 100% Chinese. She's blogging and vlogging from across the continent. She lives in South Africa, but she travels everywhere. She talks about food and about culture. And she gives a very Chinese worldview, but at the same time in a very positive context. So if everybody's looking for what Jeremy's talking about, which is a counter narrative sometimes, something totally different, I really recommend you check out Fejo Moli. She's excellent. Okay, Professor Zhang, I'm going to come back to you. We had a question here by Vera, who says, COVID-19 is a public health issue, but has heavy political and economic nuances. Who, in your opinion, do you think should write this story? Political or health reporters?
I think, for COVID-19, when it is going on, of course, we should put the health communication first. So the point is, I don't think we really lack of very good health reporter, health, communication reporter. But so far, I think the reports on COVID-19, it's more on the it's more focused on the political communication instead of health communication. So I think that's a problem. I would like to respond a little bit on the the conversation just now. I think the problem between Chinese media and African media is we have, especially Western, there are a lot of bias against the Chinese media. So how to understand the media system? But we have a different media system. But that does not mean Chinese media system is something wrong if it is different from the West. So I think
can you do me a favor? Hold on, Professor Zhang. Can you explain what is you say it's a different system. What is the difference so that people really understand what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think, the different system is just like Jeremy talked about, the Western media, the so-called Western media, Western, more liberal media. The news is focused on bad news, negative. Okay, bad news is a good news, and so that's why during the COVID-19, the Guangzhou incident, it's all focused on the negative side. But what about the good story? What about the African student was well treated in China? But no story, no report on those parts. So which means bad news is a good news. So that's not the whole picture. But in China, I think I would like to promote constructive journalism. Maybe some professors they disagree, but constructive journalism is a more balanced. It's a solution focused. It's focused on the future. So I think it's a good for us to rethink about a new approach to do the reports. Either it's a health communication or political communication. But I think it's if the news is focused too much on the negativity, there's no way out for us to get rid of the stereotype or bias.
Okay, but that's the Western media. We're not here to talk about the Western media. You study African media. Talk to us about the African media.
Yeah, last December, I gave a lecture in Addis Ababa to about 70 local journalists there, and we do the journalism training, and I introduced them the constructive journalism concept. They really, really like that concept, and then they never heard of news could be done in that way. So they set up, they like to set up association of constructive journalism even. And I think we should learn at the beginning. I think we should learn from each other how we report instead of we just close the door and to point it at the other. I don't think that's a wise.
Okay, Mayowa, you've heard it there about constructive journalism, which is a more positive view of journalism. The US European media, in Professor Zhang's view, is too negative. What's your take on what you've heard?
Personally, I feel like virtually every region of the world, of course, is trying to, at this point in time, the world is looking for alternative sources of hope. And a lot of, in the West, in Africa, people are trying to report or push stories that deliver hope to people at this point in time. Of course, like it's always said, bad news sells, travels faster and all that. So it would be there. But a new crop, maybe not even necessarily a new crop of journalists, but a lot of journalists across the world are also focusing on the good sides of global development, the good sides of COVID-19. I know that in Nigeria, a number of media outlets specifically focus on those who survived, telling stories of survivors of COVID-19. Recently, a woman and somebody way older than 80 survived in Lagos, and of course, it was all over the media pushing out the narrative that a lot more positive information can come out of this particular crisis. And of course, the way COVID-19 has hit the world, it's like everybody's business. The health reporter is going to have to report the health side of it. The economic reporter would report that. The sport reporter would speak about how it affects sports also. So I feel like while we might want to be constructive about it, there's also the need to report the situation as it is. And in some situations, it can be very negative. And at that point, it's best to just put it out there and let people know what the impact and effects of this particular disease can be. And so it helps to make informed decisions on how to handle the situation. So for example, in Nigeria, a number of media houses have started cutting down their staff strengths, laying off, cutting salaries as a result of the economic impact of COVID-19 on those media houses. So for that kind of media houses, you don't just, while they might want to do constructive reporting and all that, there's also an angle of telling the people that this is so bad that I lost. Okay, so for someone who has lost his job and is trying to report about COVID-19, whilst being objective and everything, there's also the responsibility to say that this has immense negative consequence on the country and the economy at large.
Okay, so we are coming to the end of our time, and I want to make sure that we end on time. And so first of all, I want to apologize to everybody who submitted questions that we can't get to. If I'll go ahead and put my email address in the chat. If you'd like to send me some questions, then I'll pass them on to some of our panelists, see if they can answer some of them. But I do apologize, we've just run out of time. What I'd like to do before we go in the next 2 or 3 minutes is just have each of you give a final kind of thought on how you see the COVID-19 coverage. And again, thinking about this in practical journalism terms, and simply because that's what our purpose here is today, about what you want to leave people in terms of the news.
What we want to leave people with in terms of covering COVID-19.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, I would say the one thing I've learned is that we should pay more attention to the healthcare aspects of any disease from any country than the political aspects. I think that was a failure of global media in reporting on COVID-19. Yeah.
Okay. Professor Zhang, what do you want to leave people with in terms of this discussion about how Chinese media, African media, whatever, how they cover it, thinking in specifically about the journalists in our audience today?
Since COVID-19 is the common challenge for us, I think we all should find solutions together. So I would suggest maybe it's for long term. We need to reflect on the journalistic approach, journalistic philosophy, and our media, the media's responsibility. What is the media's responsibility?
Okay, and Mayowa, what's your final reflection?
My word to every journalist at this time is we are living in a world where, like I said earlier, everyone is looking for alternative sources of hope. If you find stories or angles of the COVID-19 situation that are positive, that give that hope, you should tell it at this time. And of course, facts always at this time. The lives of people are dependent on the facts that they have, the information that they have. Information is power. The same way misinformation can be bad power. So put out the facts there, let people have to make the decisions themselves.
Thank you for taking the time in the morning, the afternoon, the evening to join us. Jeremy, if people want to follow the work that you are doing at SupChina and on Sinica, and even to subscribe to the Sinica newsletter, what can they do? Where can they find you?
The easiest place is supchina.com, supchina.com.
Okay, and then you can listen to the podcast there. And I do recommend the daily newsletter that Jeremy and his team are putting out on China. It's probably one of the most comprehensive newsletters. And it's not too long, it's not too short. It's kind of the Goldilocks newsletter, so I do recommend that. Mayowa, if people want to follow the work that you're doing and what you're reading and writing and they want to connect with you, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
I think the best way is to go to factcheck.afp.com. And of course, a number of people could follow me on Twitter I'll drop my Twitter handle in the comment section.
Okay. And I will say it's related to that Mayowa and the fact AFP is doing is getting incorporated into my newsletter at ChinaAfricaProject.com and also in some of the coverage that we do. And then Professor Zhang, I'm assuming that you're not on Twitter or Facebook or anything like that, but if people wanted to connect with you or to find out more about some of the work and research that you do, is there any way that they can get in touch with you?
I think language is really a problem. They can reach me through my, email, and I welcome all, I like to have the African journalists to reach the people they like to interview, and I'm happy to organize a similar webinar maybe next month and to discuss further on these issues.
Oh, that's wonderful. I recommend to all of our African journalists in the audience to take up Professor Zhang on that offer. Those are not easy offers to come by these days, so I definitely recommend it. And then, of course, if you'd like to follow me, I'm EO, and I cover China-Africa issues every day at the ChinaAfricaProject.com. So would love to hear from you. My email address is eric@ChinaAfricaProject.com, and Cobus, my co-host, is Cobus, C-O-B-U-S, at ChinaAfricaProject.com. Please do get in touch. And if you have questions for either Mayowa, Professor Zhang, or Jeremy, you can forward them to me, and I will pass it on to them as well. So we are right at time. I want to thank our guests. I want to thank Anton Harbour and Barry at Wits. And then, of course, want to thank all of you who are watching online and in the chat and as part of this webinar in the midweek webinar series. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Have a great day.